Thank you so much for joining me today. What I'd like to talk to you about, all of you parents out there, is what you can do to ward against your children using or abusing substances. And we're going to start by just simply talking about prevention and what prevention means. And the way that we normally look at prevention is that in some fashion, we as parents are responsible for making sure that our children never use or abuse drugs or alcohol. And in that sense that we prevent them from issues that they may incur in that use and abuse. I'd like to define it a little bit differently for all of you today. We are really not in a position to prevent our children from much of anything. Instead, what we want to do when it comes to substances is we want to work upstream. And what that means is we want to behave in ways as parents and in relationship to our children that actually stack the deck in the favor of our kids, not making choices that put them at great risk and that may cause very deleterious effects in their lives. So once again, remember that you are not the all-powerful, but you do have an enormous amount of influence in your children's lives. And that's really what we want to pay attention to as children. You know, I remember with my son growing up, and he's well into adulthood now, I had this idealistic perspective on what I could and could not, what kind of power I had as a parent. And what I learned over time was that my job is really more as a guide and a mentor. So my job is to create structure in the environment regardless of the age of my child, and within that structure allow the child to bang around and start to learn right from wrong, start to learn how to make decisions, how to solve problems for themselves. And my job is to make sure they're safe and then pick them up when they fail and dust them off and push them back out again. So in terms of use and abuse, I want you to adjust your thinking. So instead of thinking, my child will never use or abuse drugs or alcohol on my watch, the way I want you to think about it is, I'm going to do everything that is humanly possible to have a quality relationship with my child that will help them make healthy decisions for themselves when they're faced with risky situations in their lives. So let's take a look first at the big picture of how you're going to actually do this, and then we'll drill the big picture down into some smaller pieces. So the big picture is, first of all, as a parent, you're going to identify the variables that put your child at risk for possible dangerous experimentation and dependence. You're going to then create strategies and solve problems and parent with these risk factors in mind. You're going to try to delay your child's use and abuse of substances for as long as is humanly possible. And then finally, your job is also to catch dangerous experimentation early on so that your kids don't end up too far down the road before you actually know that it's happening. Let's first identify what the risk factors are for your child. Temperament can be a risk factor. Trauma can be a risk factor. Home life. Having ADHD can actually be a risk factor as well. Suffering from a mental health condition like anxiety or depression. Not having a friend group that you feel really close to, just not really having your posse in place can put a child at risk for making choices that are not safe for them. Feeling like an outsider, having family history of substance use or abuse, and as well as technology. So we know that technology, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir when it comes to technology, we're all becoming very aware at how influential our kids' screen time and content is on their development and how it can put them at risk. And finally, adolescence itself also puts our kids at risk for use and abuse. So we're going to touch on these very quickly, and then we're going to summarize what we've discussed. So first of all, your child's temperament. Your job as a parent with your child is, when that child is born, you're going to start to get to know that child's temperament. Temperament is genetic. And so you're going to start to look for things like, how does that child handle change? How does that child handle stress and anxiety? Are they introverted by nature, or are they extroverted by nature? Do they worry a lot? Do you have a child that just exhibits an awful lot of worry on a regular basis? Do they take risks easily? Maybe you have a child that just throws caution to the wind from the very beginning and doesn't seem to be very aware of their environment or able to regulate their emotions. Are they highly sensitive? So some children, you'll notice with your child, if this is the case, they tend to be very sensitive, so they take in a lot of energy from their environments. They're very intuitive by nature. They get overwhelmed or overstimulated very easily. Are your children, is your child a perfectionist? So having perfectionistic tendencies, and those don't just come from a child's upbringing, they also come from a child's genetic heritage. So do you have a child that has very high and unrealistic expectations of themselves, and when they don't meet those expectations, they fall apart or they shame themselves in the process? And then finally, you want to consider whether or not your children are very easily influenced by other kids. So you might develop a sense for whether or not they might be at greater risk for use and abuse by understanding their temperament from a very early age. Don't be fooled, though, because you could also be very wrong. You could have a very conservative, introverted child who you would think would never go out and take risks, and then they hit adolescence, and sure enough, they do the exact opposite of that. So you just want to work on getting to know your children from the time that they're brought into this world, and you'll have a better sense for perhaps where their risk factors lie. Trauma, so children that have experienced complex trauma in childhood, that trauma can get stored in the nervous system, and it can be extremely uncomfortable. Trauma can hold a person's nervous system in a very agitated state on a regular basis, and therefore that child, when they hit adolescence and there's even more stimulation going on because of their brain development, they may actually be looking for things that make them feel better, things that might numb their feelings. So a child like that might, at that stage in their lives, be at greater risk for substance use or abuse. Having a home life that may be unstable in some respects. So maybe you're having some marital issues, maybe there's been divorce or chronic illness in the family, there's financial stress, physical and emotional abuse. Anything like that can put a child at greater risk, because the structure of the environment, when it's not stable, can cause the child to not only act out, but cause the child an enormous amount of discomfort and sometimes emotional pain. And they'll be looking in adolescence to try to get rid of that. We can't talk about home life being unstable and trauma without having to mention the pandemic. And I would suggest to you, particularly if you had middle school children that have gone through the pandemic, by the very nature of that experience for those children, their isolation, their screen time, the fact that they felt out of control, their lack of social interaction with their peers, all can put them at greater risk when they hit adolescence for substance use and abuse. We talked about mental health, and if you have a child that tends towards depression or anxiety, they may indeed choose substances in order to numb out or to feel better. So keep your eye on that. And if they do struggle with mental health issues, and it's significant enough to influence their quality of life, then be sure that you get professional help for those children. Finally, family history, which I mentioned. It's very rare for a family not to have some history of substance use and abuse, because it's a natural, normal human condition because of the reward system that we have in our brains. The thoughts are that the risks for dependence are about 50% genetic. And that means that 50% of the likelihood that your child will use or abuse substances is modifiable, which is really, really exciting. So I want to just emphasize with you as we're closing out this video that you as parents are incredibly powerful in your children's lives. And your job as parents is to look upstream and hope that by doing that, you're going to be able to increase the likelihood that your children will not make decisions that put them at great risk over the course of their lives. And again, make sure you pay attention to the variables that we discussed today as influencing factors on how you learn whether or not your children might be at greater risk. And out of all of those, I want you to focus most significantly on the temperament of your children and their mental health. So do the best you can. Use a parenting style that is more authoritative rather than authoritarian. And what I mean by that is be collaborative with your children. Don't just be black and white and tell your kids, this is how the world is, this is how you're going to act, and this is why. What you want to do is you want to be collaborative with your children from a very early age in a way that allows them to have a voice in their own lives. But your job is to maintain control and maintain the stable structure within their environment. So good luck and enjoy the process of raising your children. Thank you.